everyone, welcome to our podcast where we talk about the intersection of technology and climate change. We are your hosts from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Ensong.
I'm Clara.
And I'm Michael.
To tackle climate change, technologies such as solar radiation modification, carbon capture, and carbon removal are being developed and getting attention as a tool of mitigation. But what are these technologies and could this really alleviate the current situation? Today, we are very excited to look through these technologies and their potential risk with a focus on carbon dioxide removal technology, joined by Marie-Valentine Florine, Director of the International Risk Governance Center at EPFL, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. Marie-Valentine, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for welcoming me. Yes, I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to meet you too. As we know, the EPFL International Risk Governance Center is known as an interdisciplinary unit dedicated to extending knowledge about the increasingly complex, uncertain, and ambiguous risk that affects society. Could you tell us more about the International Risk Governance Center's current work on environmental sustainability and what are the most pressing issues?
Sure. Let me begin by saying that over the years, the IRGC has developed frameworks and guidelines to deal with, as you said, risks marked by complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, with a focus on emerging risks and systemic risks. And we've published guidelines for governing these kind of risks back in 2016 and 18. So IRGC is also a foundation. It has worked with EPFL in the past few years. And while we are here, we have decided to focus on or to prioritize work on technologies. And in 2021, we've decided to work on the problem that some emerging technologies may cause risks to environmental sustainability. And the problem there is, in fact, that we don't know the outcome of an emerging technology, and we don't know in which context it will be deployed, because this will happen is, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years. So we decided to do work on that. And I would say the most pressing issue, if there will be one single pressing issue, is precisely not to take decisions just on the basis that something is urgent, but also look at the long-term consequences of technological and policy choices.
As I know, some climate engineering techniques are being developed to remove CO2 from atmosphere. And as I said, we don't know what are the potential risks and what things that we have to consider. But we were wondering, what are your thoughts on carbon dioxide technologies and how can they help us achieve the necessary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, as you've seen, or as you know, we in IRGC have been doing some work on carbon dioxide removal. And let me begin by saying that it is absolutely necessary to reduce the quantity of CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. Remember, CO2 can stay in the atmosphere for about 100 years before decomposing. This is what the IPCC reminds us. And we won't be able to deal with climate change the way we would like with only emission reduction. Of course, we have natural ecosystems that can act as sinks or reservoirs for CO2, but that's not sufficient. Carbon dioxide, carbon capture and sequestration, which is done at industrial plants, is also necessary, but it counts as emission reduction, not as reduction of the CO2 atmospheric concentration, the one that is already out there. So CDR, carbon dioxide removal, does not help reduce emissions per se, but it helps removing CO2 that was emitted since roughly 1850, since we burn coal and oil for the industry and economic growth. Every year, we add roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we need to bring this down to zero. Roughly, we need to remove each year 10 gigatons of CO2 in order to get down to a level that will be acceptable in terms of climate. And 10 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gases or CO2 each year is 1 million times more than what we currently do. And this represents a compound annual growth rate of almost 60%. So this is really enormous. So under nature-based approaches, we very often talk about or include afforestation. As you know, planting trees, growing biomass can capture CO2, and CO2 is sequestered in forests, wetlands, oceans, and soil. And these solutions have lots of co-benefits in agriculture for preservation of ecosystems and for biodiversity, and also adaptation to climate change. Under engineered approaches, let me just focus on one, which is the kind of most extreme engineered approach. It's called direct air capture and storage, DACS. You basically suck CO2 from the atmosphere and store the carbon somewhere. The carbon can be used in long-lived products like concrete or sequestered. I mean, it is contained and mineralized in underground rock layers, for example, in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So every and each technique comes with its own estimates in terms of removal potential, in terms of risks, the cost, the countervailing risks, the uncertainties, the trade-offs, and governance challenges. None of these techniques is a kind of silver bullet solution.
As part of your article also in 2022, you published an article called How Could Policy Address Risk from Carbon Dioxide Removal? And as you said, there's both trade-offs and benefits. And we would like to know a little bit more about what we still don't know about these technologies, what are their trade-offs, and what are the risks that we have to think about.
So I suggest we focus on the two extreme techniques or approaches, afforestation and DACS. So growing biomass and versus capturing or removing CO2 directly from the air. Both techniques have a range of uncertainties. Taking afforestation or nature-based solutions, most of them have a very large land footprint. And this very large needs in terms of land could make them compete with agriculture and biodiversity. So it's not an obvious solution or decision for policy to say, let's go with afforestation. Also, irrigation may be needed in some places, which could impact the ecosystem. In many countries, you would have to have fire suppression systems that would have to be installed to reduce the risk of wildfire. And perhaps using genetically modified plants would be better in some climates and certainly help address the buildup of carbon in soil. But all these techniques come with lots of uncertainty about indirect impacts in neighboring environment. And moreover, nature-based solutions may not be as permanent as we would like. They are susceptible to reversal through catastrophic events like fires and floods, and perhaps also man-made threats such as deforestation. On the side of DACS, the risk of reversal is lower than in nature-based solution, but it still exists. But let me give you now just quick figures about the range of uncertainties about how much CO2 can be removed by these techniques. It's been estimated, and this is the latest IPCC estimates, that afforestation globally in the world could remove between 0.5 to 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. Remember, I mentioned, I gave the figure of 10 gigatons that should be removed per year earlier in my introduction. So this is really both a very large range of uncertainties and also probably not sufficient. With regards to DACS, the estimates are from 5 to 40 gigatons per year that could be removed through these techniques, but DACS is much, much more expensive. In terms of cost, afforestation could cost from $0 to $240 per gigaton per year, and DACS could cost between $100 to $300 per gigaton of CO2 removed every year. So we have a range of uncertainties To summarize, the risks of deploying these techniques, and every technique can be grouped in two categories. The first is that there could be side effects, undesirable consequences, and the second is the impermanence of the storage, the risk of saturation in soil or biomass, the risk of leakage, or even the risk of reversal. So to conclude, I think we should probably move forward with a kind of portfolio approach. Continue to experiment on all techniques, work with affected stakeholders on matters of feasibility, acceptability, accounting, possibility to establish standards, good practices, and perhaps mandate. But this is not an easy task.
And since you mentioned that indeed, in order to reach a level that is acceptable, we won't only deal with emission reduction. My question is, how do you balance the need for technological innovation with the potential risks and uncertainties that come with introducing new technologies?
So in a complete risk management or governance process involving technologies, so basically how you decide about the technology, given that the technology comes with opportunities, benefits, but also new risks, what you begin with is by assessing the technical risks. And once you've assessed the technical risk, then you assess how people perceive the technology. People's perception is extremely important for making decisions about technologies. Do people like it? Will people use it? How will they behave with the new technology? And doing that, you also assess the benefits and the risk from a social science point of view. And then you collect all this information, or risk assessors pass all this information that results from scientific work to other people. Let me just call them other people who will look at this, and they will form an opinion about whether the risks are acceptable, unacceptable, or tolerable. Tolerable means if management measures are put in place. And this is a very important step before deciding about deploying a technology. This is a very important step in what we call the risk governance process. It prepares the decision about the risk and the technology, because it also produces options for risk management. What can be done to reduce the risk in such a way that it becomes acceptable in view of the expected benefits? So this is how we balance technology innovation and the opportunities that come with it, with the potential risks and uncertainties that come along. The complications, though, is that much of this is a forward-looking exercise. We can do this for existing technologies. You can do this for lots of things that exist already, and it's pretty well done already. So this is not a big issue. But for emerging technology, we don't have all the information that would be needed to make an, remember what policy decisions are supposed to be based on science, so an informed decision or a science-based decision. So this kind of exercise of collecting data that is missing, we don't have the right instruments to measure the outcome. We don't know what people think. We don't know if we will like it. All this must be done in parallel to foresight exercises to explore possible futures with or without the new technology. And then we decide which future we want to pursue. So eventually it's a very much political decision. It's a societal decision. It's a bit complicated to give you an example in the sense of in the field of carbon dioxide removal, because all this remains very theoretical with us. We have a good understanding that climate change is a problem, but choosing among many techniques and also arbitrating between should we put emphasis on reducing emissions at source or more emphasis on should we remove what has already been emitted. This is a very, very complex problems.
And especially because you mentioned the various approaches, the categories of risk, and especially risk governance. My question is, in your view, what are the most promising emerging technologies for addressing climate change, and what role can risk governance play in ensuring their safe and sustainable deployment?
The most promising techniques regarding CO2 emission reduction, well, I think that the low-hanging fruit of conventional renewable energy with solar, wind, hydro remain the most promising. And if you read the latest summary for policymakers, the IPCC summary for policymakers that was published last week, we see that very clearly. Regarding carbon dioxide removal, many people expect that the techniques based on biomass, so storing carbon in biomass, especially planting trees, are the most promising. And the reason I think is because these techniques are easy to understand. But as I said before, there are lots of challenges, uncertainties. So I would be on the side of those who say that we should consider direct air capture and storage, DACS. It is perceived as the most expensive, but it has lots of advantages. And indeed, many industries, including Microsoft and Swiss Re, are investing real money, I should say, are investing in DACS. And you also asked me about the role that risk governance can play. What the role of risk governance can play here is ensuring that the risks that are inherent to any decision regarding climate change are clearly elicited and acceptable and accepted by society, people, and the economy. So the success of a technology depends on several factors. Yes, I would like to add this. The success of the technology depends whether the technology outcome responds to a real problem or a demand. It must also be effectively an improvement over existing technologies. If it is just duplicating other technologies, the chances of success are less obvious. Of course, it also must make business sense. You have wonderful technologies that have never been deployed because we don't know how to pay for it, or there is no business model that allows its deployment. The technology should not cause new risks that cannot be mitigated. And to finish, I would say the technology must be deployed in an appropriate context. And here I would go back to the two CDR approaches that I suggested for today: afforestation and DACS. Afforestation is okay in some regions, but less in others. Of course, you can have bioenergy with storage of carbon in soil. That's okay in certain regions. That's not doable in others.
In light of what you said regarding how important it is in this context and in the context of technologies to always be forward-looking and use this approach, looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for addressing climate change?
I think that the biggest challenges are vested interests, political and economic barriers. The oil industry, politicians that prioritize provision of cheap energy to their electorates, for example, all these constitute what I call vested interest, political and economic barriers. They are understandable. I don't mean they are acceptable, but they are understandable. So we must understand the reasons for that in order to unlock the situation. There is also the risk of or the challenge presented by technology lock-ins. When you're locked into an old technology and you don't want to amortize your investments in this technology and change for a new one that would be better in terms of climate acceptability. Now, the biggest opportunities, as you know, I would say the current crisis that we see now with droughts, flooding, major severe weather events, these crises are ways to make everybody realize that this is serious. So it's not per se an opportunity, but this is something that triggers action.
Thanks so much for that response. The work that you're doing is really fascinating, and we wanted to hear a little bit more about what motivated you to pursue a career in this field and how you sort of got into it, and also what are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered in pursuing a career down this track.
I've not spent much of my career in this domain. I've done a lot of very different things in my life, and I think that every experience I had contributed to building my view on career in this respect. So I mean, if you ask me kind of personal advice, that is, do different things in your life. Don't do always the same thing. It's by learning from different domains, working with different actors, that you actually learn how to cope with difficult questions. With regards to climate change, carbon dioxide removal, risk governance, what I think personally interesting is to speak about scientific matters to non-scientists, because we need this to make everyone understand the mechanisms of climate change. It's also speaking about non-technical matters, such as those from social sciences to engineers to technologists and technical scientists, or speak about how policy making works to scientists. I mean, scientists have a very blurred view about policy work. You know, they often perceive this as being wrong, fuzzy, irrational, and quite often, and unfortunately, they do not try to understand the challenges that policymakers face. I found personally this very fascinating. You know, establish bridges between people of different disciplines, of different interests and objectives.
We're getting to the end of this episode. I have certainly learned a lot here, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we really appreciate your time. Is there anything that you want to leave us with?
I think the kind of interdisciplinary work that you're doing is really needed. And I'm personally convinced that together we can find solutions to these problems. There are indeed good signs of solutions, and I very much welcome people who communicate about the good news. We should dig into the problems, look for good news, communicate around the good news, and look forward to the future with optimism.